any language, you can express northwest, east, south, one way or another, right? It may be that the terms have very different origins. They may relate to wind direction, they may relate to sun direction. Those are probably the two major ones. They can relate to the directions of important rivers. In ancient Egypt, the main directions are expressed, as I understand it, by reference to the Nile, which makes perfect sense. But there's always some way to tell people which way you are going or facing. Now, in modern Germanic languages, English, Dutch, German, and the Scandinavian languages, we have terms that are all clearly cognate, and they are all derived pretty easily from the same ancestors in Proto-Germanic. The same cannot be said if we take those Germanic languages and we roll them back to their Proto-Indo-European ultimate ancestor. The terms for Northwest, East, and South are not cognate across the Indo-European language family. They have largely been remade in each different branch. That's not to say there was no way to talk about this in Proto-Indo-European. There probably was, only that people have revised exactly how they express these things. This sort of thing happens. Color is another example of this, where, for example, all Indo-European languages have a way to say white and black, but they don't use the same words. Now, for the words that we use and their origins, probably the easiest and the most universal is east. East contains the same root that we see in a lot of Indo-European words for the dawn. So, for example, this is the same root that's in ancient Greek, eos, the dawn, or in Latin, aurora, at least the hour part of it. Notice Latin has a common change of S to R that we also see in Old Norse, independently in its own history. Now, the East word is also really good evidence that the Romance languages, which have adopted Germanic terms for the cardinal directions, actually ultimately adapted those cardinal direction terms from Old English and not from another Germanic language. Because if French had borrowed the word for east from Old Frankish or Old High German or Old Saxon or Old Dutch or Old Norse, you would probably expect the vowel there to be something like ost. But since it's est in French, that E vowel really the only place where it's easy to imagine that you could have gotten that is Old English. So at some point in the history of Old French, perhaps mariners or fishermen or traders or something like that, encountered their Old English speaking counterparts who persuaded them to give up their old terms like orientalis, septentrionalis, occidentalis, australis, those terms in Latin, in favor of the shorter Germanic words. It is then from French, presumably, that those terms are borrowed into other Romance languages, such as Spanish and Portuguese. And by the way, those Latin terms have, solid Indo-European etymologies too. Septentrionalis is something to do with seven, right? Septem, I think that it's from the bear constellation, right? And orientalis is the arising direction, so same etymology sort of as east, just a different word. And then the east word, the dawn word, is actually what goes into australis, the east, the south word in Latin, which means that Australia, which is the southern land, and Austria, which is the eastern kingdom, actually do ultimately have, and they are ultimately sort of Indo-European cognates, even though that root gets applied to the Eastern Germanic and the South in Latin. It's kind of an interesting thing, right? I assume because the sun is to the south in the northern hemisphere. Anyway, and then occidentalis in Latin, that's the direction that the sun falls. All right, now let's look at quick things I can say about the etymology of west, the weird etymology of north, and especially south and how it relates to the sun. South. Now, we got scorched by the sun all winter and spring in Colorado, and now it's May and it looks like this. So I can't make the point I was going to make about south quite as well, but here is the point about south and north in Colorado. Behind me is south of me, and you can see there's a lot of trees on the mountainside. On this side of me is north of me, and you can see it's a little bit more bare. That's pretty typical in Colorado because the sun is coming from the south, right? So it's shining on it's shining to the north. So to the north, it's going to be more bare because it's melting off the snow, which is most of our precipitation. And plants aren't getting as much, so you're not going to grow as many trees. Whereas that mountain has its back to the sun, as it were, so its north face has more trees. So when you're in a west-east canyon, which most of our canyons are, south side is more treed, north side is more bare. Now this lines up with the origin of the word south, because south means the direction of the sun. So the Proto-Germanic word would be, or the root would be sunth. Now in English that becomes south because we lose n's before th. So think about tooth in English versus tunthus in Gothic. And in Scandinavian, that's originally going to become sunner from sunthas, sunthus. So compare tunthus, tooth in Gothic, to ton in Old Norse, or tan in Norwegian, right? In Norwegian, you go to a tannlege, a tooth doctor, a dentist. Now, the direction from which the sun shines makes a lot of sense for the northern part of the world. I should point out that the Scandinavian words for this may look a little bit less like the Old Norse word than you might expect, because Old Norse has a change NR to ER that is very regular. This is what happens to manar becoming mother, man, in Old Norse, right? So in Swedish, you see söder, which is from that soother, that mutated form, S-U-Ed-R, not S-U-N-N-R. In Danish, you see syd, which is same thing. You also see sunder, which is actually from the NNR form, like in Sunderjylland. That's a typical Danish thing where NN becomes ND. Think of, man spelled with an ND in Danish, or tan spelled with an ND in Danish. Those are from words that ended in NN, or roots that ended in NN in Old Norse. And in Norwegian, you usually see sur. And what's happened there is you start with a point that's basically like the Swedish word, but very, very often in Norwegian you lose those D's or those Eds, right? That's your classical silent D in Norwegian, except in this case the D is no longer spelled either. West. Well, it doesn't get any more west than FM Light and Sons in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. And west comes from the Proto-Indo-European word for evening, something like vesperos. This is cognate with Latin vesper, evening, Greek hesperos, evening, etc. It's literally just the direction in which the sun sets. North is actually from a root for down or below. It may be distantly related to the same root that's in like Netherland, beneath. This is interesting because why is it what's down? Is it because it's what's to your left when you're facing the sun that's rising? And left is usually regarded as lower than right. Maybe. Is it because that's the direction that the underworld is held to be? I mean, in Old Norse, you do tell people to go north and down when you're telling them to go to hell. That seems possible. It is actually related to a Sanskrit word that means hell. So there's something interesting back there. Well, folks, I appreciate you checking out another video on my channel that I've been tinkering with for 10 years here, where I try to give good information about Norse language, myth, runes, etc. Let me know what you think about this hybrid format of indoors and outdoors, where I'm trying to have the audio be somewhat acceptable in every part. And thanks to those supporting the channel on Patreon, thanks to those buying my books, especially the second edition of the Poetic Edda, especially those getting signed copies from Boulder Bookstore and from beautiful Colorado. I'm wishing you all the best.